It's time again for the Throttle Up Leadership Podcast with Dr. John Dentico. The mission of our podcast is to provide 21st century leadership training for a talent-driven world. We help organizations implement strategies and practices designed to attract, hire, engage, and retain top talent while mitigating the effects of burnout. Our guests are experts in various fields of organizational dynamics, including, but not limited to, leadership, management, communication, and coaching. They bring a world of knowledge and solutions to our viewers and listeners. I am sincerely grateful for their participation and ideas. So let's dive in. And if you enjoy our podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. We genuinely appreciate your support. Good morning and welcome to the Throttle Up Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. John Dentico. This morning, Glenn Parker is with me. Glenn is an author, team building and leadership consultant, father, grandfather, community activist, and volunteer. Glenn is the author of some 17 books, including several bestsellers on team building and leadership. Glenn has worked with organizations to create and sustain high-performing teams, effective team players, and team-based systems. His best-selling book, Team Players and Teamwork, Josie Bass, was selected as one of the 10 best business books of 1990. A completely revised and updated second edition was published in 2008. It was brought to the screen in the best-selling video, Team Building, What Makes a Good Team Player, from CRM Films. His training and team building instrument, the Parker Team Player Survey from Zycom, distributed in 1991, has sold more than 1 million copies around the world. Glenn is one of only 75 management experts recognized in the Guru Guide, published by Wiley in 1998. Glenn is co-author with his son Michael of Positive Influence, the leader who helps people become their best self, and the just-released Positive Influence 2, Leadership in a Time of Crisis. I am pleased to have him here with me today on the Throttle Up Leadership Podcast. Good morning, Glenn. How are you?
Good morning, John. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, me too. Let's not waste any time and get down to brass tacks, as they say. You often talk about positive influence leader. What is a positive influence leader from your perspective?
That's a great place to start. And let me, instead of giving you a textbook definition, let me tell you a story. And we use a lot of stories and quotes that we picked up along the way in our research for these books and for many other books. But I'll tell you my personal story about how I first encountered a leader who was a positive influence. Take you back a long way to my first job out of grad school, my first boss, and now it's my first performance appraisal. So I'm in the meeting with Larry, my boss, and we're talking about my performance over the last year since I joined the organization. And he's pretty happy with what I've done. And I would say parenthetically that I was a researcher. I would be given something to look up and then write a report. And then I was given another topic and I would look up information and write a report. And I got pretty good at it. But quite frankly, just between you and me, John, it was pretty boring. And I noticed the people across the hall that were doing leadership training seemed to be always having a lot of fun. And because they were traveling all around the country, they were traveling internationally, and they would come back with these stories about what happened in these workshops, and of course, crazy travel stories as well. So I said to Larry, we get to that point in the performance appraisal where they talk about your development plan, right? I think we all can relate to that. And he said, what do you want to do going forward? I said, Larry, I think I'd like to try leadership training. Could I sit in and observe a class? So he said, Glenn, as a matter of fact, I'm going down south next week to conduct a couple of leadership training workshops myself, and you can come with me, except there's just one thing. I really can't justify your travel expenses unless you teach something. My lips start to quiver, and I go, wait, Larry, I don't know anything. How could I teach something?" So he said, "We'll figure it out." And he did, and we did. And it was a 2-day workshop, as I said, and he gave me 2 hours in the afternoon of the second day about a topic that he knew that I could knock out of the park, and I did well. Now, the thing about Larry is that he didn't say, which he could have said, and I can imagine some leaders saying this. I'll give you my notes and my slides, and you can teach the 2-day class. I'll sit in the back of the room and I'll give you feedback at the end, and we'll see how you do. He didn't do that. What he did was he positioned me for success. He gave me something that he knew that I could do well, and he put me on a spot on the program, on the agenda, where the class was really warmed up. The only thing I could probably do was really screw it up, which I didn't do. And so that's one of the key things about a positive influence leader is that they position you for success. The other thing, which is really critical in this story and it demonstrates one of the key characteristics of a positive influence leader, is that he saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. I thought of myself as a sort of a nerdy researcher, and he said, "You can do something else." And that changed my life. It changed the direction of my life because from then on, I started to focus on leadership training and all kinds of other development activities for people. And that was life changing for me and career changing for me as well. But the key thing is, and I didn't recognize what Larry did at the time. I'll tell you this. This is upon reflection and learning something myself, but he did something that we associate with people who are positive influences on others and make a key change by recognizing something in that person that they don't see in themselves. Does that resonate with you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've had the honor and privilege in different venues of working with people like that who I can remember one person, especially when I was an officer in the Navy. As soon as you checked onto the ship, he was the executive officer, the number two in command, and sitting in his office, he said, "You know what my job is on this ship?" I said, "No, XO. What's your job?" He said, "To make my officers look good in front of the captain."
Yeah.
And I will never forget that. It
Yes.
was so, I've never heard, and I had been in the Navy then by about 5 years. I had never heard anybody say that. And it was just overwhelming. And the other thing that I found in me, Glenn, was I wanted to work for this guy.
Yeah.
I wanted to give him everything I had. You know
Yes.
what I mean?
Absolutely.
You're
Yes.
going to take care of me.
Yeah.
It's the first thing I learned as a young naval officer. Take care of your people and they'll take care of you. And you're going to take care of me. I'm going to take care of you. There's no question about it. Yeah, I've had the honor and
Yeah.
privilege of knowing people like that.
That's a great story. Yeah. That really is a great story.
So, Glenn, let me ask you a question here. So, your just released book is called Positive Influence to Leadership in a Time of Crisis. Let me ask you, do you think, as you take a step back and look now across the horizon, if you will, or the spectrum of leadership, do you think leadership itself has changed somewhat in the wake, let's say, of the COVID pandemic?
I think it has, because I think people realized that there were certain limitations because of the crisis, because of what COVID did to all of us personally, but also as organizations and as leaders. And so certain things couldn't be done. Don't forget, we're now talking about many businesses that could do it were working remotely. So that changed things dramatically. I think there was a lot of pressure on leaders during this time to be all knowing and all successful because everybody was looking to them for what should we do. And So as a result, what I described really was that it became old wine, new bottle, because there were many things that you and I, John, know from history and working as a leader and working in coaching leaders that were very successful but had gone out of favor a little bit. For example, what really had to happen is that leaders had to show a real caring and concern for employees because employees were stressed out. And that's one of the major findings that we had in the research for this book. And by the way, we talked to CEOs and other senior leaders in industries and businesses most impacted by the coronavirus crisis, COVID-19 crisis. And that was healthcare, that was hospitality, that was education, real estate, transportation, all of these things. And what many of them told us that the biggest challenge that they faced was the emotional toll that all of this was taking on their employees. And oh, by the way, on them too, because they were feeling this stress as well. And so you had this emotional toll because they were worried about their employees. They were also, by the way, quietly worrying about themselves and worrying about their families and what they were maybe bringing home from work. So, for example, let me, because I've got a lot, I want to share some quotes with you from the research. For example, Mitch, who was a CEO of a major real estate company in New York, Seville, he said that my biggest concern as a leader was dealing with the mental health of our people while trying to maintain a positive, upbeat culture during this time. And so also these leaders had to look within themselves for what am I doing? And so a lot of people took to because they had to do certain things. They had to be concerned about the employees and a much heightened concern. Um, and I think that's probably the main thing. And so there was a lot more of what I called a sort of a community of caring that really evolved during this time, where there was a lot of personal communication between leaders and people in their organization, people in the workplace or people who were working remotely. I could go on, but that kind of gives you the flavor of what was going on. It was the emotional toll that was really the biggest impact on leaders during this time and consequently on the people in their organization.
I completely understand. And I think it was well founded. Certainly. It's like you're standing out on a sunny day one day, and the next thing you know, you're in the middle of a typhoon, in a manner of speaking.
Yes, and to add to that, just to refresh everybody's memory, that during this time as well, piled on top of all this emotional stress, working remotely. And by the way, when you people started to work remotely, it seemed like the workday never ended.
Sure.
Because they could always find you, right? They could always find where you couldn't say I was in transit or I was stuck on a plane or something like that. They knew exactly where you were. And even when the workday ended, the calls and Zoom calls stopped, there was the stress of family life because everybody was home. The spouses were home, the children were home, and there was worries about family finances. Are we going to have our job? Can we pay our bills? The kids are home trying to learn remotely, and there's a lot of confusion about how do I do this, and I'm so used to learning in a different way, and now I got to learn. And so parents now have to jump in as instructors, and very often, and I'm sure you've heard this, parents are like, I took math, but I don't recognize any of this math because it's
Right.
quite different than the way I learned it. So you had all this stress piled on top, yet again, was all the demonstrations that were going on across the country, the Black Lives Matter, the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and the hundreds of thousands of people that were in the streets protesting. Many of those people in the streets were employees of companies who were not happy with what was going on and how the how people were being treated by the police. And so all of that stress. And so many leaders reacted during this time. And let me give you a couple of examples of some of the things that we uncovered in the research that leaders did during this time. Um, for example, the CEO of Nordstrom's, the retailer, Eric Nordstrom, an incident occurred in Florida and with an employee of one of their stores. He got on a plane. He flew to Florida to meet with local police and the employee because that employee alleged that he was being mistreated by the police. But he went down and personally addressed the issue, and the issue got resolved. But it was something that he had to take on personally, and because there was this need to be concerned and caring about the employees. A woman that we interviewed, Jody McLean, who's the CEO of Eden's, another real estate company that owns and manages a number of shopping centers and malls. What she did was a very interesting thing, John. I wonder how you react to this. She sent everybody in the company a copy of Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And she set up small groups throughout the company, because they have locations all over, with a facilitator, small groups of 10 people, to discuss that as a kickoff, the Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, and to get the feelings out about what was going on out in the streets, but how that impacted the company. And that was a very salutary result. So those are the kinds of things that were going on during this time. If you, I can go on with some other things, but one of the things I guess I do want to mention before I throw it back to you, is that communication during this time with employees was key. Communication, and it was also extremely difficult for leaders because um, what happens, some leaders have this view that unless I have complete and accurate information, I can't go out there with a message. And that turned out to be exactly the wrong way to do it. That because, and by the way, because if you don't do it, there's this big ball of silence. And what happens? People fill that silence because they all have access to television, to social media, to all kinds of conspiracy theories that are floating around. And as a result, people make up a lot of things that very often are not true. So, what the really effective leaders had to do, John, was to get comfortable with maybe incomplete and changing information. One of the people that we interviewed, Rob Zimmerman, he's with a company called NAES. They operate a bunch of power plants around the country. And of course, power plants know about crises. And he said a very interesting thing that I want to share with your listeners. He said, you can't be paralyzed by the fear of giving the wrong answer. We had to get comfortable with something like, look, folks, this is what we know today, but stay tuned because things may change tomorrow. But I wanted to give you an update as we know it right now. And that was a learning for a lot of leaders to be able to be comfortable with that. And as a result, clear messaging and communication became a critical item. And I'm certainly prepared to talk some more about that. But let me toss it back to you if you want to follow up or clarify any of that.
Yeah, great. An accounting principle I learned many years ago called the cost of perfect information. That the cost of perfect information may be too high. You're trying to figure out You're trying to get more information before you make a decision, but by the time you make the decision may be overcome by events. Other things have happened. It's always an interesting thing. The other thing I can't help it but mention this. In the Navy, on a naval ship, for example, where I served on naval ships, the commanding officer of a ship has one collateral duty. Okay. There are different collateral duties assigned to different officers, like the legal officer or the public information officer. All these different kinds of collateral duties are given to different officers at different ranks. Captain has one alone, one collateral duty. It's called the morale officer. If morale sucks, it's the captain's fault.
Right.
You cannot give that away. You cannot give it to somebody else. And I've often thought, what happens if the CEOs of organizations, whether they be for profit or not for profit, were told and accepted the idea that they themselves were the morale officer? That in fact, if morale is bad, it's their fault and they have to figure it out. Because then you would find them taking a greater level of action, doing something more. I'll mention this. In the simulations I created, the lead sim simulations, which are not based on any computer, it's 40 people in a room playing 7 different entities in a very complex, realistic scenario. Okay. And a lot of that, part of the scenario is something critical happens, a critical event occurs. And now they have to communicate about that, not only amongst the different entities, but a lot of times press conferences being held in the room. And a lot of times you'll see people very iffy, if you will, that's the term I'll use right now, about doing that. And the answer is no, you got to get out there. You have to put a public face on the problem, as you said, number one. And here's the other thing people don't think about. Symbolically, the symbolism of a CEO standing up and making a statement. As
Right.
you said, it may not be perfect. Things are changing, things are moving along. Again, you have to get out there and you have to make a statement and let people see you, because they want to see the person in charge, if you will, taking charge and doing something about it.
I think it's a great point, and it's also a very good example. So the getting out there, that the phrase that you used, I think, is extremely important, and it's relevant to a number of the leaders that we interviewed. They got out of there. For example, Barry Rabner is the CEO of a major hospital system here in New Jersey. He got out of the executive offices and was walking the floor of the hospital. I almost can't imagine, even though I've talked with him and other people in that hospital a lot, what it must have been like. Because he said on February 15th, we got our first COVID patient. That was 2020. By the end of that month, by March 1st, we had 90 patients. And by the way, we were doing just trying to keep them comfortable because we didn't know how to test for it. There was no COVID test. There was certainly no treatment. It was very stressful. So what he did is he got out and he said, I was walking the floors. I walked the floor of the hospital every day and said, John, how are you doing? What can I do to help? What do you need? Do you need some time off? Do you need some time to yourself? Do you need to talk to somebody? Because the minister over here or our resident psychologist is available to talk to you. What do you need? Um, and by the way, you better, when you ask somebody, how are you doing and what do you need? And they give you an answer, you better get back to them. And that's what he did. Now, they might have said, "Can we need more N95 masks?" He at that point had to say, "I'm doing my best, but we can't get any more." In fact, he told me this crazy story where they ordered some online. They're purchasing people because they had already established a just-in-time purchasing system, and they needed a lot more than what was on hand and what was ordered. And a bunch of them came in and they were defective, and they had already paid for them. It was crazy kind of thing. The DJ was the COO of Amtrak, the rail company, the transportation company, run trains all over the place. He got out the same thing. He's walking the platforms. And when talking to passenger agents and talking to ticket agents, same thing. Talking, he said, I rediscovered something. When I first started out, it was some people may remember the great Tom Peters, who talked. He's the first one that talked about what management by walking around, and people were getting back to that kind of thing. In many places that weren't still functioning, you couldn't walk around. For example, we interviewed the CEO of a company that owns 21 Red Robin restaurants. That's a chain of mid-range restaurants, and they couldn't walk around. He had 21 restaurants. He wasn't traveling around anymore to visit those restaurants. So he would have a regular call with the 21 general managers of those restaurants, and they would talk about how things were going, how were they surviving, reducing the menu, supply chain issues with food, and so forth, and with keeping people on staff. And he said prior to this, Glenn, those 21 restaurants competed to be the number one in the system in terms of revenue and customer satisfaction and all the measures that they use to measure success in that business. And he said, what we started to do during this time is that if somebody had a good idea in one restaurant, like how they reduced the menu to make it manageable, they shared it with all the other restaurants. And he said, as a result, we got some really good ideas and they got shared around and people started using them. And we became more collaborative than competitive. And we're still doing that now. I've stayed in touch with him because he's not that far from me. And I happen he's just a great guy. His name is Mike Axios. Um, and they became a more collaborative thing. But Mike is also, I think he's a tremendous leader. He's a great communicator. And he said, I very often would just pick up the phone and say, John, how you doing? Talking to the general managers, because he's trying to assess how their emotionality was and how they were addressing things. So you had a lot more of that going on.
Let me jump in here for a second because I want to go back to something you talked about before. And that was this whole notion of emotional health, this notion of emotional health during the crisis. So let me tell you, let me just preface this by, as I look at things right now, I understand, of course, and you see this graphic behind me, we live in this VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That that continues,
Right.
if you will. But my observation is, as we go on, the pandemic, and I could be mistaken here, but the pandemic is getting farther and farther back in in people's rear view mirrors. And now we've arrived at a point, and several of my former podcast guests, we've all talked about this, where we're now looking at, and I'm spending a lot of my time on things like attracting, hiring, retaining top talent, and also mitigating the effects of burnout. So let me ask you this question. How do you see what leaders have to do today in order to, let's just say, hire on and attract, hire on, and retain top talent? Because in what most people would say, and I've talked to people, yesterday I was on with someone in Germany, a consultant in Germany. I've talked to people in Australia, in the UK, here, certainly here in the US, about this, what we call the struggle for talent or the talent war. In a sense, what's happening now is talent, this is my opinion here, is now dictating the terms under which they will hire on and stay. Because if there's such a talent war going on, and they're working in a quote unquote toxic workplace, they may just say, "Hey, look, you keep it. I'm going across the street. I'm going someplace else." So how do you see now the outgrowth of this emotional health and its effect on hiring and retaining top talent? You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that what happened, and this is what people reported to us, the ones that were effective during this time in doing the things that we talked about, being collaboration and innovation, and they didn't have this. You remember that there was this thing for a period of time called the Great Resignation Crisis, that employees were quitting for many of the reasons you're talking about. But I guess what a lot of the really good leaders discovered, or maybe rediscovered, was that the way to keep people was to have a great place to work. I actually wrote an article which we can post or we can send to listeners who are interested. It was called Creating a Great Place to Work. And it was about how I compared two restaurants, actually, that these were actual restaurants. We, of course, changed the names to and how they differed in creating a great place to work. And a great place to work means that the leader cares about them. What leaders discovered during this time is that my job didn't end at the plant gate or at the office door. It extended beyond that to the total employee and in some cases to their family. This caring about you, this asking, how are you doing, and meaning it. It's not just a phrase, but you have to come across as what? Authentic, that you're the real deal, that actions are back up your words. You actually do care. You follow up. You ask. I've watched this fellow, Mike, and I met him in several of these Red Robin restaurants, and I see him communicate, and I see him, he's watching what the general managers are doing, and he's talking to them about it and saying, good job there. And so also what happened during this time where the leaders began to recognize that we've got some really great people here and we haven't recognized them because in many cases you had people working remotely, essentially unsupervised. And these people were having to make decisions on the spot. What do I do with this customer or this visitor to our restaurant or this patient in the hospital? I can't wait to ask my boss. I've got to make a decision about that right now. And they suddenly began to realize that these employees that we have, many or if not most of them, were very talented. So we rediscovered what? Empowerment. It was almost empowerment by default, but they were empowered to make decisions because they had to. It was required. And so many of the leaders that were really effective in creating this great place to work that people wanted to stay and work were not only empowering employees to act, because what are you doing what are you saying to someone when you empower them? You're saying, I trust you to do the right thing, to do a good job. Empowerment and trust are two sides of the same coin. And that's when you say you trust somebody, that's a very high compliment. You're saying something very powerful to them. The other thing is, the other related to that is the idea of recognition and in some cases reward for positive behavior and positive action. And so all of that goes into creating the great work, the great place to work. And I think there's some more to it that we can add in terms of the changing leadership styles as well. But I'll throw it back to you.
Okay. Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, trust is a transcendent value. If you don't have trust, you have nothing. It's the fuel that runs the engine. It's as simple as that. It overtakes other values as well. And if you have trust, you have everything. The I'm very careful to be perfectly honest, about using the word empowerment. And it's become a mega word. It's a mega word. It's everywhere. Conferences on just called empower this and empower that. When you look at it, and here's why you have to be careful, in my opinion. If you look up the definition of empowerment, there's another word that closely associated with it, and that's called delegation, right? Delegation is the age-old term for empowerment, as you well know.
Right.
And you also know we've been talking about delegation for 50 years. That's been going on and on. And the critical issue, and I'm just going to use delegation just for a second. I want to stay on that idea. It's always the knock about on delegation is this. Many times, and I've seen this personally, we delegate the responsibility to do a job, but oftentimes we don't delegate the authority to carry out that responsibility. I'm sure you've seen that 100 times at least. So when someone is given the opportunity to make a decision and, in a sense, be empowered, or the delegate, I hope, that they're also given the authority to carry out that responsibility. Because if they're not, what happens is they're always going back and saying, can I do this? Is it all right if I do that? Yeah, okay, go ahead, do that. Okay, so they make a decision. They come back and they go, well, listen, I want to add this to it. Can I do that? Rather than saying, listen, I did it. And, the old adage, it's better to ask for forgiveness than it is for permission in some respects. So that's one of the other things that I'm very cautious about. And I will go one step further. And this is John Dentico out on the limb, okay, out on the edge. People I talk to, or the organizations I've talked to, are what I would call part of the skill talent pool, okay? They have 5, 10, 15 years of experience. They may have a bachelor's, master's degree in a particular area. Not in all cases, but a lot of them have experience, they have knowledge. And a lot of times we don't see, or maybe don't want to see, the hidden side of empowerment. There's a hidden side. And the hidden side of empowerment is when an individual, I'm going to use the term delegate, okay? I'm going to use the term delegate just to denote direction. When that individual delegates the power of their education, experience, background to the organization, I'm giving my power as an individual to the organization. In a sense, it's the reverse flow of the diverse flow of delegation to the company, because without the people, the company is really nothing. Okay. So that to me is always the hidden side. And there's a very interesting, and we don't call that empowerment. There's actually a very specific word for that. And it's called subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is when I, John Dentico, delegate my power, my background, my education, and my experience back to the organization. And I think that if many senior leaders in the organization started to come to grips with that, or start to see that side of it, I think there'd be a much better understanding. And here's where I agree with you 150%, where we're going to create an environment where people come to do their best work every day. Because I need the power of the people. I need the power of their education experience in order to make my organization go. I'd like to hear your response to that.
Yeah, I think the smart leaders recognize also that empowerment is not just a feel-good leadership trait. It makes really good business sense. I've worked in a number of industries, in particular pharmaceutical industry, where speed to market is really important. So when people are truly empowered to make decisions, things move along a lot faster. If I have to stop and get approval from my boss, we're stating the obvious here. It slows down the process, besides what it does to that individual who's had to wait to see what my boss says about it. It's diminishing that person, and it makes them, I think, less productive, because they're not using a lot of their talents because they're afraid of being second guessed or corrected or written up, as they say sometimes. But the empowerment is a powerful business tool. And because it moves things along a lot, because when you trust and say, okay, hey, you can make this decision, then you're saying a lot about the person, but you're also allowing them to move this process along a lot faster. And therefore, it's a really powerful business tool to get things done and to beat your competitors, because that's what we're trying to do here. We're just not, it's not just create this organization just to make people feel good. We're creating this organization to produce a quality product that makes some money for the organization and for the shareholders. So that's a big part of it. I think too, for leaders, what we discovered um, during this time, that a number of them said to us, John, because we said to them, "What'd you learn? What'd you learn about yourself as a leader during this time?" And a lot of them said, "I learned I didn't always have to be the smartest person in the room. I didn't always need to be the smartest person in the room." And first of all, that's a very stressful place to be if you always have to be the smartest person in the room. And if that's the case, by the way, what the heck are we have this all these people sitting around the room for? We might as well just ask you what we should do. We don't have to call a team meeting and get everybody's input. We got you. And so that was one of the big learnings, is that they didn't always have to be the smartest person in the room. Another guy said it's a different way to us. He said, "I didn't always have to be the first person to come up with the answer. I could allow the discussion to flow, and maybe, just a crazy thought here, there'll be a better idea than the one that I had that will come out of this, because I'm not only engaging people, but when you say, John, how do you feel about it? What do you think we should do? I'm not only trying to make best use of your knowledge, but I'm also making a powerful statement about how I feel about you, that you have some smarts there that we need, and we need your input." So that was a big thing they learned. The One of the other things that they learned is that it's it was a it was pretty damn stressful. That this was a very stressful time. And after a while, people realized how stressful it was and what it was doing to them, especially the ones that were holding a lot of this in. They were holding a lot of it in because it was either a sign of weakness, or they just wanted to they wanted to be there for their people. They had good intentions, but withholding a lot of that was not healthy for them. If I may, let me uh, read to you some of the quotes, because they said it a lot better than I can say it. One of the leaders in the hospitality industry that we interviewed said, "Listen to this, John. I took things too personally. It got to me. I had a heart attack." Let me float that one out there. "I learned from that experience that I need to go more with the flow and empower my staff." That was I took it all in, and felt like I had to be the man. Another one said, "I internalized a lot of stress in trying to be there for everybody." What I was telling you about walking the floors and talking to people and making phone calls, I took it all in, and I internalized a lot of stress in trying to be there for everybody, because I was concerned about them. Good intentions here, right? I felt that people in the organization always expected me to be there. And it was not healthy for the organization, but not healthy for them. One of the leaders in healthcare said his personal feelings. I had to be positive in the face of the virus. I had to and did overcome my fear, my personal fear of getting sick, and yet go to work every day. I even surprised myself because a lot of you go to work every day, you have family, you have young kids at home, you're afraid of coming home and giving the virus to them. We didn't know a lot about this stuff. I know one of the CEO of the hospital said to me, I came out after a day's work and I'm tired, and I go out to the parking lot and I see that there's somebody just sitting in one of the cars alone. And I realized that it's one of my nurses. And I go up to the car and I look in and she's crying. She's sitting in the parking lot by herself in the car crying. And she sees me and I kind of wave and she rolls down the window and she said, I'm scared to death and I don't know what to do. She said, I want to go to work because I don't want to let my teammates down in the hospital, but I'm scared to death that every day I go to work, I could bring home this virus because I have my mother-in-law living with me as well, and I'm scared to death that I'm going to give it to her or anybody else that I encounter. So a lot of this during this time it was very stressful for them, and they had to learn to shed some of that and some of the things that we talked about just earlier: empowerment, making use of your staff, not feeling you had to be the person all the time that made the decisions, that absorbed this way, so on. The craziest thing, John, if you worked, there were so many advisories, so much guidance coming at you. You had the WHO, the World Health Organization, issuing guidance, the CDC in Washington, your your state health department, the local health department. If you were part of an industry association, maybe the National Restaurant Association, they were issuing guidance. It was driving people crazy because they had to, what do I do with all this stuff?
Right.
And making sense of it. Does
Right.
that make sense
Right.
to you?
I believe in a couple of things. One of them is you never know where a good idea is going to come from.
Right,
So you have to be open to it.
right.
And I am now more proud than ever to say that 30 years ago, when I started working on my own collaborative leadership model, it was based on one thing and one thing alone, and that was contribution. The idea is you come in, you set an issue or problem in front of people, and you say, who's got an idea? Anybody want to help? What can you do for us here? Help us get through this. And it starts the conversation, hopefully, starts the conversation where people can collaborate and can arrive at one, two, or maybe even three courses of action that can be followed that will that will help us overcome this these issues that are in front of us. Let me ask you one last question as we're getting close to the end here, Glenn. What do you hope the information in your book will do for leaders or prospective leaders today?
I think the main hope is that people will be prepared next time because by their own admission, they weren't prepared. It hit them like a lightning bolt, like it hit the rest of us, understandably, that they will have a crisis management plan. That's a thing, and that
Yep.
we should have that. What do we do? What do we do about communication? Do we centralize everything so we make sure there's one message that goes out? Do we decentralize? A crisis management plan. What concerns me, I must admit, as a little caveat here, is that we asked everybody, did you do an after action review? From your military experience, what an I is, right? AAR
Right.
is. Unfortunately, very few did an after action review. Everybody was so anxious to get back to normal, whatever normal was, that they said, we did it informally. But you know that doing An AAR is not it's not a lengthy experience, but it's an organized experience where you review what did you do, what went well, what didn't go well, what would we do differently next time. And that
Otherwise, otherwise in the industry known as lessons learned.
yes, and that was right. That was lessons learned. And I actually, because of that, wrote a brief article on how to do an AAR,
Great.
and we can share that with your listeners as well. But that's what I hope. We at the back of the book, there's a a survey instrument, an organizational survey instrument that people and an organization to do to help them prepare for the next crisis. And that's the one of the big takeaways from the book is that having that at the back of the book. And we strongly recommend that people do that.
Where can people get your book? Where is it available?
It's available from our publisher, which is HRD Press. So if people who are in that field know HRD Press, been around for 50 years. And of course, it's available on Amazon as well. We encourage people to do it. I've enjoyed this conversation an awful lot, and I want to, because of that, I want to share a little giveaway with your listeners, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
So let's say the first 5 people that I get an email from with their name and mailing address, I will send them a complimentary copy of Leadership in a Time of Crisis. They send it to Glenn, it's Glen, at thepositiveinfluenceleader.com. I'll say it again, Glenn at thepositiveinfluenceleader.com. First 5, we'll send it and we'll sign all 5 of those as well, enhancing the value, of course, greatly. Yeah, so feel free to do that. I'm sure you'll probably put that in the show notes as well.
Yep.
Sorry about that. Anyway, so I appreciate that and the opportunity. I look forward to hearing from people. If they have stories of positive influence, I love hearing about them. So if they have a personal story like mine, what I told you about Larry at the beginning of our talk, I love hearing about that. And on the website, thepositiveinfluenceleader.com, we have a that's called Stories of Positive Influence. And it's a good chance we would put your story up there as well. With that in mind, thank you very much, John. I love talking with you.
And thank you very much for being with us today on the Throttle Up Leadership Podcast, Glenn. I wish you all the success in the future. Thanks again so very much.
Okay, and to you.